The champagne was flowing like a golden river through the ballroom of the Beaumont estate, and the air was thick with the scent of 5,000 white lilies. My son Julian looked happier than I had seen him in a decade, standing tall in his custom-tailored tuxedo, his hand possessively resting on the small of his new bride's back. Sloane Blackwood, now Sloane Sterling, was a vision in ivory lace, a masterpiece of grace and calculated poise. To the 200 guests gathered in that gilded hall, we were the picture of American excellence, the Sterling family, pillars of Greenwich society, celebrating the continuation of a legacy. But as the orchestra transitioned into a soft melodic waltz, Sloane leaned toward me, her lips brushing my ear as if she were sharing a sweet, daughterly secret. "This is a beautiful party, Alistair," she whispered, her voice like velvet wrapped around a razor blade. "But let's get down to business. I want the deed to the Hamptons estate and a $5 million trust set up by Monday morning. Otherwise, I'll tell Julian and the press that this miracle baby I'm carrying isn't his. I'll tell them it's yours. And in this town, Alistair, the scandal alone will burn your precious Sterling and Sons antiquities to the ground before the sun sets." She pulled back, flashing a dazzling, camera-ready smile for the photographer hovering nearby, her eyes cold as a New England winter. I felt the air leave my lungs, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I reached into my jacket pocket, my fingers brushing against a small, cold object I had hidden there. I didn't scream. I didn't collapse. I simply looked at her, matching her smile with a mask of my own, and reached for my glass. I knew then that the war hadn't just started, it was already entering its endgame. But to understand how I ended up being blackmailed at my only son's wedding, you have to go back to a quiet Tuesday in March. I was in my private study at the Sterling Manor, the late afternoon sun casting long, amber shadows over the leather-bound books and the 18th century French furniture I'd spent 40 years collecting. Business was steady, the kind of quiet success that comes from a lifetime of careful curation and a reputation for absolute integrity. My late wife, Eleanor, used to say I had an eye for the truth in objects. I could spot a forged signature or a faux veneer from across a room. I only wish I'd had that same clarity when it came to people. The phone rang at 4:15. It was Julian. "Dad, are you home? I'm coming over. I have news. Life-changing news." Julian had always been a sensitive soul, prone to grand gestures and even grander disappointments. He'd spent his 20s chasing various passions that never quite materialized, often leaving me to settle the debts or smooth over the social fallout. But there was a vibrance in his voice I hadn't heard since he was a boy. "Of course, Julian. I'll have Mrs. Higgins set a place for you," I said, feeling a flicker of hope. Maybe he'd finally found his footing. He arrived an hour later, but he wasn't alone. Sloane Blackwood walked into my home with the confidence of someone who already owned the floor she was stepping on. She was striking, certainly sharp features, eyes the color of flint, and a way of moving that suggested she was always 3 steps ahead of the person she was talking to. "Dad, this is Sloane," Julian said, his face flushed with a terrifying kind of adoration. "The Sloane I've been telling you about." Except he hadn't. He'd mentioned a consultant he'd met at a gallery opening a few weeks back, but that was it. Now they were standing in my foyer, their fingers intertwined so tightly Julian's knuckles were white. "It's an honor, Mr. Sterling," Sloane said, her handshake firm and practiced. "Julian has told me so much about the Sterling collection. Your reputation precedes you." Her eyes weren't on me, though. They were scanning the foyer, lingering on the Ming vase in the corner, the Regency-era mirror, and the original oil painting by a Hudson River schoolmaster. It wasn't the look of an art lover. It was the look of an appraiser. I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck, the same feeling I got when a dealer tried to pass off a high-end replica as an original. Dinner was a masterclass in subtle interrogation. Sloane didn't ask about my health or my hobbies. She asked about the operational structure of Sterling and Sons. She wanted to know the valuation trends of the estate and if the Greenwich property was under a historic preservation easement. "Julian tells me you're considering expanding into the digital auction space," Sloane said, swirling her Cabernet with a practiced wrist. "With the right capital infusion, you could dominate the North American market. It seems a shame to keep such a vast portfolio so localized." "I prefer the personal touch, Sloane," I replied, keeping my tone light. "In my world, a handshake and a lineage mean more than an algorithm." "How traditional," she said, and for a split second, the mask slipped. There was a flicker of disdain in her eyes, a flash of "out with the old" that made my stomach turn. Then Julian dropped the bombshell. Dad, the reason we're here, the reason we're moving so fast. Sloane's pregnant. We're going to be a family. We're getting married in 3 weeks. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crack the floorboards. Julian, my 32-year-old son who had never held a job for more than a year, was going to be a father. And this woman, whom I had known for exactly 45 minutes, was going to be the mother of a sterling heir. 3 weeks? 3 weeks, I managed to say, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Julian, that's quite a rush. Surely we should take some time to— There isn't time, Dad, Julian snapped, his defensive wall rising instantly. We want the baby to be born into a stable, married home. I knew you'd do this. I knew you'd find a way to make this about process and propriety instead of just being happy for me. I am happy for you, Julian, I lied, the words tasting like copper. I just want to make sure you're prepared for the reality of this. Sloane reached across the table, covering Julian's hand with hers. We're very prepared, Alistair. We've already been looking at properties in the backcountry. Something with at least 10 acres. A legacy home for the baby. The legacy home she was describing cost upwards of $12 million. She was already spending money that wasn't hers, money that Julian didn't have, money that would have to come from the Sterling Trust. After they left, I sat in my study with a glass of scotch that I didn't want but desperately needed. My instincts were screaming. The timing, the pointed questions about my assets, the way she looked at my home like it was a checklist of liquidatable assets, it was all wrong. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sloane's eyes scanning my foyer. She was a predator, I was sure of it. But Julian was my only son, the only piece of Eleanor I had left in this world. If I moved too fast or too aggressively, I would lose him. I had to be surgical. The next morning, I did something I had never done in my life. I called Silas Vane. Silas was a fixer for the old money families in Connecticut, the kind of man who found the things people spent a lifetime trying to hide. He wasn't cheap and he wasn't particularly pleasant, but he was the best. I need a full workup on a Sloane Blackwood, I told him when he picked up. Current associations, financial history, and most importantly, any previous names. I want to know what she's hiding before she walks down that aisle. Give me 48 hours, Alistair, Silas rasped. But a word of advice? People like her don't usually hide things in the attic. They hide them in plain sight. Check your own house first. I didn't know what he meant until 2 days later when I went to the safe in my office to retrieve Eleanor's engagement ring, the 5-carat canary diamond that had been in the Sterling family for 3 generations. I had promised Julian he could use it for the wedding. The velvet box was there, but when I opened it, my heart stopped. The ring was gone. In its place was a high-quality cubic zirconia replica. It was a good fake to the untrained eye. It would have passed. But I wasn't an untrained eye. I held it under the jeweler's loupe, my breath hitching. The setting was slightly off, the stone too perfect, lacking the natural inclusions of the sterling diamond. Someone had been in my safe. Someone had the combination. And only 2 people besides me knew it, Julian and the woman who had spent the last 3 nights staying in his guest suite at the manor. I was staring at the fake ring when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Silas Vane. There were no words, just an attachment, a PDF file titled Blackwood, Sloane, History. I opened it, and as I scrolled through the first few pages, the room began to spin. Sloane Blackwood didn't exist 4 years ago. Before that, she was Sarah Miller from a small town in Ohio. And Sarah Miller had a very interesting track record. 2 marriages to wealthy men over 60, both ending in unfortunate circumstances, and 2 massive out-of-court settlements that had mysteriously vanished into offshore accounts. But it was the last page that truly broke me. It was a photo of a medical record, dated only 2 weeks prior. Sloane Blackwood wasn't pregnant. She'd had a total hysterectomy 3 years ago following a complication from a previous surgery. She couldn't be pregnant. The miracle baby was a lie. The marriage was a heist. And my son was the mark. I looked at the fake diamond in my hand, then back at the report on my screen. I could feel the cold, hard resolve of the Sterling lineage settling into my bones. She thought she was playing a game with an old man who was blinded by his love for his son. She thought I was a relic to be appraised and sold. She had no idea that I was the one who had spent 40 years learning exactly how to handle a fraud. I picked up the phone and dialed Silas. I have the information I need. Now, I need you to find me a very specific type of recording device. Something small enough to fit in a tuxedo pocket, but sensitive enough to catch a whisper. Planning a party, Alistair? Silas asked. No, I said, my voice as cold as the fake diamond. I'm planning a revelation. I didn't know it yet, but that was the easy part. What happened next? The trap Sloane was already laying for me would nearly cost me my life and my sanity before the first note of the wedding march even played. The revelation of Sloane's hysterectomy felt like a physical blow, but the missing sterling diamond was what truly terrified me. It meant she wasn't just a grifter, she was already inside the vault. Over the next week, I had to play the part of the doting, supportive father, while every fiber of my being wanted to scream the truth at Julian. I watched them together at the breakfast table, Julian, looking increasingly haggard but buoyed by a frantic, manic energy, and Sloane, the picture of serene expectancy, often rubbing her flat stomach with a wistful smile that made my skin crawl. We've decided on the Beaumont estate for the ceremony, Sloane announced one morning, tapping away at her iPad. It's a bit over the initial budget, Julian mentioned, but for a sterling wedding, we can't exactly settle for a country club, can we? Julian looked at me, a silent plea in his eyes. He was already drowning in the costs she was racking up. The Beaumont is significant, Sloane, I said carefully. The rental fee alone is 6 figures. It's an investment in our future, Alistair, she replied, her voice sweet but her gaze pointed. Unless, of course, the sterling legacy isn't quite as robust as Julian led me to believe. She was testing the fences, seeing how much I'd pay to keep the family's image intact. I simply nodded and authorized the transfer. I needed her confident. I needed her to believe I was a soft target. Silas Vane called me late that Thursday. I've got the device you wanted, Alistair. High-gain microphone, voice-activated, looks like a standard Mont Blanc pen, but that's not why I'm calling. I followed the money from the fake diamond, and I held my breath. It didn't go to a jeweler or a pawn shop. It went to a private medical clinic in New Jersey, a very discreet place that specializes in unorthodox paperwork. She's not just faking the pregnancy with words, Alistair. She's buying a paper trail, ultrasounds, blood tests, the works. She's building a fortress of lies that a simple, I don't believe you won't knock down. I felt a chill. She was professional. Most gold diggers rely on charm. Sloane relied on documentation. She was preparing for a legal battle before the first I do was even spoken. There's more, Silas continued. She's been meeting with a man named Marcus Vane. No relation, but he's a shark. A disgraced lawyer who specializes in aggressive prenuptial agreements. If Julian signs whatever they've cooked up, she won't just get a settlement if they divorce. She'll get a seat on the board of Sterling and Sons. The stakes were higher than I'd imagined. She wasn't just after the cash. She was after the crown. That evening, I tried one last time to reach Julian. I found him in the library, staring at a bottle of bourbon but not yet pouring. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in 48 hours. Julian, I said, sitting across from him. We haven't really talked since your mother passed. I know things have been tense, but I need you to listen to me as your father, not as your benefactor. Julian sighed, a heavy, defeated sound. If this is about the money, Dad, I'll pay it back. Sloane has a plan for a lifestyle brand. She's going to... It's not about the money. It's about Sloane. I leaned forward. Julian, I've seen things in my career. Forgeries that look more real than the originals. People who can mimic every detail of a masterpiece but have no soul underneath. I'm worried you're looking at a replica. Julian's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp anger. A replica? Is that what you think of her? Because she didn't grow up with a silver spoon and a pedigree? Because she actually has ambition? Julian, she's lying to you. About her past. About everything. Stop it. He slammed his hand on the desk. She told me you'd do this. She said you'd try to poison me against her because you can't stand that I'm finally building a life you didn't curate for me. You've controlled every aspect of my existence, Alistair. My schools, my friends, my career path. Well, you don't control this. She's not pregnant, Julian, I said, the words finally hanging in the air. The silence that followed was deafening. Julian stared at me, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. For a moment, I thought I'd reached him. Then, he let out a harsh, jagged laugh. You really are desperate. She showed me the ultrasounds, Dad. I've heard the heartbeat. We went to the clinic together last week. I realized then how deep the deception went. She'd probably had a confederate at the clinic, or played a pre-recorded loop. She had orchestrated a reality for him that was more convincing than the truth. I'm done, Alistair, Julian said, his voice cold and flat. If you come to the wedding, you come as a guest, not as a father. And if you say one more word against my wife, you'll never see me or your grandchild again." He walked out, leaving me alone in the dark. I felt like the floor had finally given way. I had the truth, but the truth was a weapon Julian was using to cut his own throat. The next 3 days were a blur of wedding rehearsals and floral deliveries. I moved like a ghost through my own home. Sloane was everywhere, her presence like an invasive vine. She replaced Eleanor's portraits with modern abstract pieces she'd bought on my dime. She rearranged the furniture. She even spoke to the staff as if they were hers to fire. At the rehearsal dinner, held at a waterfront restaurant in Greenwich, Sloane pulled me aside. She looked radiant in a silk slip dress, the fake sterling diamond glinting on her finger. "Julian told me about your little talk," she whispered, her smile never wavering as she greeted a passing senator. "It was a bold move, Alistair, reaching for the not pregnant card. But you should know, I'm very thorough. Every doctor, every record, every witness, they all say the same thing. I'm a glowing mother-to-be." "You can't maintain a lie of that magnitude forever, Sloane," I said, my voice steady despite the fury vibrating in my chest. "I don't need to maintain it forever," she hissed. "I just need to maintain it until the paperwork is filed. And if you try to stop me tomorrow, I'll make sure Julian knows exactly how you tried to pay me off to abort his child. I've already got the forged emails ready to go." She tapped my cheek playfully. "Smile, Alistair. It's a wedding." I watched her walk away, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of genuine fear. She wasn't just a grifter. She was a sociopath. She didn't care about the money as much as she cared about the win. That night, I met Silas Vane in a darkened parking lot behind a diner. He handed me the Mont Blanc pen. "It's live," he said. "The signal is encrypted and uploads to a cloud server I've set up. Whatever she says to you, I'll have it in high-definition audio." "And the other thing?" I asked. Silas handed me a small, discreet gift box wrapped in silver paper. It took some doing, but I found the original dealer. He was more than happy to talk once I mentioned the FBI's interest in conflict diamonds. Inside the box was the real sterling diamond. "She sold it for less than half its value," Silas said. "She needed quick cash to pay off Marcus Vane and the clinic staff. She's leveraged to the hilt, Alistair. If this wedding doesn't go through, she's not just broke, she's going to jail for a dozen different counts of fraud." I held the ring, the 5-carat stone catching the dim light of the street lamp. It felt heavy. It felt like history. "Tomorrow," I said. "Tomorrow," Silas echoed. "But be careful, Alistair. A cornered animal doesn't care who it bites." I went home and sat in Eleanor's garden. The wedding was 12 hours away. I had the ring, I had the recorder, I had the truth. But as I looked up at the darkened windows of my son's room, I realized that the hardest part wasn't going to be exposing Sloane. It was going to be watching Julian's heart break in front of the entire world. I didn't know then that Sloane had one more card to play. I didn't know that she had been watching me too. The morning of the wedding, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. It wasn't from Sloane. It was an anonymous tip, written in a cramped, nervous hand. "Check the Beaumont Estates security feeds for room 402, 2 a.m. Your son isn't the only one she's marrying today." I felt a surge of adrenaline. Was she cheating? On her wedding night? No, it was something more calculated. I arrived at the Beaumont early, bypassing the frantic wedding planners and the floral crews. I made my way to the security office, a small room tucked away in the basement. The guard was a young man, bored and easily swayed by a $100 bill and the sterling name. "Room 402, I said. "Last night, 2 a.m. He pulled up the footage. The hallway was empty, the shadows long. Then, at 2:03 a.m., the door to room 402 opened. A man stepped out, looking over his shoulder. He was tall, mid-40s, wearing a sharp gray suit. It wasn't Marcus Vane. It was Julian's best friend and business partner, Harrison Reed. I watched as Sloane stepped into the doorway, wearing nothing but a silk robe. She leaned in and kissed Harrison, not a friendly kiss, but a deep, lingering one. They whispered for a moment, then Harrison handed her a thick manila envelope. She smiled, tucked it under her arm, and retreated back into the room. I stood in the flickering light of the security monitors, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. It wasn't just about my money, it was a hostile takeover. Harrison wanted the company, Sloane wanted the estate. They were working together to gut Sterling and Sons from the inside out, using Julian as the Trojan horse. I walked out of the security office, the Mont Blanc pen heavy in my pocket. The ceremony was in 2 hours, the guests were arriving, the trap was set. But as I walked past the bridal suite, I heard the sound of Sloane's laughter through the door, vibrant, triumphant, and utterly merciless. I didn't know it yet, I whispered to myself. But what happened next would change the Sterling name forever. Seeing Harrison Reed's face in the light of day after watching that security footage felt like looking at a cracked piece of porcelain. The flaw was invisible until you knew exactly where to press. Harrison had been like a second son to me. He and Julian had been inseparable since their days at boarding school in New Hampshire. When Julian's mother passed, Harrison was the one who slept on our couch for weeks, making sure Julian ate, making sure he didn't spiral into the darkness that always seemed to be nipping at his heels. Or so I had thought. Now, every memory of Harrison's loyalty felt tainted, like a masterpiece that had been secretly painted over with cheap acrylics. I stood in the grand hallway of the Beaumont estate, the polished marble reflecting the frantic movements of the wedding staff. I could hear the distant tune of the string quartet practicing Canon in D. It was a beautiful sunny morning in Greenwich, the kind of day that usually promised new beginnings. But as I walked toward the groom's suite, my hand instinctively gripped the Mont Blanc pen in my pocket. I wasn't just a father today, I was a man walking into a den of wolves, and the most dangerous one was the one wearing the best man boutonniere. I opened the heavy oak doors to the suite. The smell of expensive bourbon and cedarwood hit me instantly. Julian was sitting in a velvet armchair, his head in his hands, while Harrison stood over him, adjusting Julian's cufflinks with a steady, practiced hand. "There he is," Harrison said, looking up with a bright, predatory smile. "The man of the hour. Alistair, you look like you haven't slept a wink. Nerves getting to you?" "You could say that, Harrison," I replied, my voice tight. I looked at Julian. "How are you holding up, son?" Julian looked up, and my heart ached. The bags under his eyes were deep, and his skin had a translucent, sickly quality. He looked less like a groom and more like a prisoner awaiting execution. "I'm fine, Dad, it's a big day. A lot of pressure." "You're doing great, Jules," Harrison said, patting his shoulder. The gesture, which once would have seemed brotherly, now made my stomach churn. "Once the ceremony is over and the papers are signed, everything gets easier. Right, Alistair?" He was goading me. He knew about the aggressive prenup Sloane had pushed. He probably helped draft it. I walked closer, standing directly in front of Harrison. I wanted to see if his eyes would twitch, if the mask would slip. "The paperwork is just a formality, Harrison," I said quietly. "It's the intent behind it that matters, wouldn't you agree?" Harrison didn't blink. "Absolutely. And Sloane's intent is very clear. She wants what's best for the family, for Julian, for the legacy." I thought about the manila envelope from the security footage. I thought about the kiss in room 402. I wondered if Julian had any idea that his brother was currently helping his wife to dismantle his inheritance. I wanted to grab Julian by the shoulders and shake him. I wanted to scream that he was being played, but I knew Julian. If I attacked Harrison, he'd defend him. To Julian, I was the controlling patriarch, and Harrison was the only one who understood him. "I have a gift for you, Julian," I said, reaching into my other pocket. I pulled out the small silver box. Julian's eyes widened as he opened it. The real sterling diamond caught the light, throwing fractured rainbows across the room. Harrison's breath hitched a tiny, sharp sound that was the only crack in his composure. He knew that stone was supposed to be in a pawn shop in New Jersey. He knew I shouldn't have it. "The ring," Julian whispered. "Dad, I thought I'd lost it. I couldn't find it in the safe last night. I was going to tell you, but I was so ashamed." "You didn't lose it, Julian," I said, staring directly at Harrison. "It was just misplaced. Someone thought they could replace it with a fake, but an original always finds its way back home." Harrison's smile had vanished. He looked at the ring, then at me, and I saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. He realized I was onto them. He realized the old man wasn't as oblivious as they'd hoped. "It's beautiful, Alistair," Harrison said, his voice dropping an octave. "A very timely recovery." "Indeed," I said. "Julian, why don't you take a moment? I need to have a quick word with Harrison about the reception logistics." Julian nodded, too mesmerized by the diamond to notice the tension. Harrison followed me out into the hallway, closing the doors behind us. The air between us was electric. "You're playing a dangerous game, Alistair," Harrison said, the best man persona falling away. "Julian is fragile. If you blow this up now, you won't just lose the business, you'll lose him." He'll never forgive you for ruining this day. Is that what you and Sloan discussed in room 402 at 2 in the morning? I asked, my voice a low growl. Harrison froze. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. He opened his mouth to lie, but I cut him off. I have the footage, Harrison. I have the records of the consulting fees you've been funneling from the firm into Sloan's offshore accounts. I know about the hostile takeover you're planning. You've been my son's shadow for 15 years and you're willing to burn him alive for a seat at the table? Harrison stepped closer, his face inches from mine. You don't understand how it is, Alistair. Julian was born with everything. I had to work for every scrap. I've kept this company afloat while your son played artist and philosopher. I deserve that seat. And Sloan? She's a force of nature. You can't stop her. Even if you tell Julian, he won't believe you. She's already told him you're suffering from early onset cognitive decline. She's been planting the seeds for months. I felt a surge of cold fury. They weren't just stealing my money. They were gaslighting my son into thinking his father was losing his mind. Check your phone, Harrison, I said. He frowned, pulling his phone from his pocket. I saw his face go pale. I had sent him a single screenshot from the manila envelope I'd recovered from his own car earlier that morning, a task Silas Vane had handled with his usual terrifying efficiency. It wasn't a business contract. It was a DNA test result for the miracle baby. But it wasn't the one Sloan had shown Julian. This one was real. It showed that Sloan Blackwood, or Sarah Miller, was indeed pregnant 3 years ago, but the child had been given up for adoption. And the father listed on that old document? It was Harrison Reed. You're not just her partner in crime, Harrison, I whispered. You're her history. You've been running this long con together for years. Julian wasn't just a mark. He was the biggest payday you've ever had. Harrison was shaking now, his fingers fumbling with his phone. Alistair, listen. No, you listen, I said. The ceremony starts in 60 minutes. You're going to go back in there, and you're going to be the perfect best man. You're going to stand there while I give my toast. And if you so much as twitch, I'll have the police waiting at the end of the aisle before the amen. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the hallway. I thought I had the upper hand. I thought I had cornered the wolf, but I didn't know yet that Sloan had been listening from around the corner. I didn't know that she had a backup plan that made Harrison's greed look like child's play. As I made my way toward the bridal suite, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I opened the message, and my blood turned to ice. It was a photo of Julian, taken from a high angle. He was sitting in the armchair I'd just left him in, but there was a small red laser dot resting right on the center of his chest. The text underneath read, Alistair, I hope you're enjoying the wedding. I'd hate for a tragic accident to spoil the festivities. Why don't you come to the Rose Garden, alone? Let's talk about that pen in your pocket. My heart plummeted. She knew. She knew about the recorder, she knew about the evidence, and she was willing to put a literal target on my son's back to keep me quiet. I looked toward the groom's suite, my hand trembling. I couldn't call the police. I didn't know where the shooter was. I couldn't tell Julian. He was a sitting duck. I walked toward the Beaumont Rose Garden, the scent of the lilies now smelling like a funeral. The garden was empty, a labyrinth of high hedges and blooming thorns. In the center of the maze stood Sloan. She had changed into her wedding dress, a cloud of silk and lace that made her look like an angel. But as she turned to face me, she was holding a small, sleek remote control. You really should have stayed in the library with your old books, Alistair, she said, her voice devoid of its usual sweetness. You're a master of the past, but you have no idea how the future works. Where is he, Sloan? I asked, my voice cracking. Where is the shooter? He's a professional, she said, checking her watch. And he's very patient. He'll stay there until the ceremony is over and the marriage certificate is signed. Once I'm a sterling, he disappears. If I'm not, well, Julian has always been a bit clumsy, hasn't he? A stray bullet from a hunter in the woods behind the estate. It happens more than you'd think. You're a monster, I said. I'm a woman who knows her value, she corrected. Now give me the pen, and the ring, and the files Silas Vane gave you. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the Mont Blanc pen. I knew if I gave it to her, I lost everything. But if I didn't, I lost Julian. I took a step toward her, my mind racing. I had one card left, the one thing she didn't know I knew, the one thing that even Harrison didn't know. I'll give you the files, Sloan, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. But you should know, I'm not the only one who has them, and I'm not the only one who knows about the other, Sarah Miller. Sloan's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? The one who died in Ohio, I said. The one whose identity you stole. Did you really think you could bury a body and a name that deep? Sloane's face went perfectly, terrifyingly still. The remote control in her hand trembled. What happened next, I thought, was the moment I realized that in this family, the ghosts were more dangerous than the living. The silence in the Beaumont rose garden was so absolute I could hear the rhythmic clicking of the sprinklers in the distance. Sloane's face, usually a mask of ivory perfection, began to twitch. The mention of the real Sarah Miller had struck a nerve I didn't even know existed. For a woman who had spent years erasing her footsteps, the sudden appearance of a ghost was more terrifying than any police report. "You're bluffing," she hissed, though the way she gripped the remote control told a different story. Sarah Miller is a common name. You found some small-town tragedy and you're trying to pin it on me. It won't work, Alistair. I've scrubbed every record. You scrubbed the digital ones, I said, taking a slow, measured step toward her. I could feel the weight of the Mont Blanc pen in my pocket, the silent witness to this entire nightmare. But you forgot about the analog world. The ledger in a small-town coroner's office, the memories of a high school teacher who wondered why her brightest student vanished and was replaced by a girl with the same name but different eyes. Silas Vane is very old-fashioned, Sloane. He likes dusty basements. I wasn't entirely sure if the body part was true. Silas had only hinted at a discrepancy in the vital records, but in the high-stakes game of psychological warfare, a well-placed lie is often more effective than a poorly timed truth. "Give me the files," she demanded, her voice rising. "Now, or I swear to God the red dot on Julian's chest becomes a hole. If you kill him, you get nothing." I countered, my voice as cold as the marble statues surrounding us. "Julian hasn't signed the new trust documents yet. He hasn't signed the marriage certificate. If he dies now, the Sterling estate stays with me. You'd be the prime suspect in a high-profile murder with no payoff. Is that the future you planned for yourself?" She hesitated. I could see the gears turning. She was a mathematician of greed, and the numbers weren't adding up in her favor. "I have a counteroffer," I said. "One that keeps you out of an orange jumpsuit and keeps my son alive, but you're going to have to play your part perfectly for the next hour." Before she could respond, the heavy garden gates creaked open. Harrison Reed stepped into the garden, his face flushed and sweat beading on his upper lip. He looked between Sloane and me, his eyes landing on the remote in her hand. "Sloane, we have to go," Harrison panted. "The guests are seated. Julian is asking for you. He's starting to get suspicious. He saw me talking to his father's fixer in the parking lot." Sloane turned her fury on Harrison. "You idiot, I told you to handle the perimeter. If Julian starts questioning things now, the whole deal falls apart." "It's already falling apart," Harrison shouted back, his composure finally shattering. "Alistair knows everything. He knows about the DNA test, Sloane. He knows about the baby we had in Ohio. I can't keep lying to him." I watched the two of them, the force of nature and her partner, begin to tear each other apart. It was the classic collapse of a criminal partnership. When the pressure builds, the strongest link always tries to sacrifice the weakest. "Shut up, Harrison!" Sloane screamed. She turned back to me, the remote control trembling in her hand. "Fine, we do it your way for the ceremony. But the moment the I do's are said, we're going to the study. You're going to sign over the Hamptons deed, and then I'm taking Julian far away from here. You'll never see him again, but he'll be alive. That's the price of your interference." "Deal," I said. I had no intention of letting that happen, but I needed to get Julian out of that chair and away from the sniper's line of sight. The walk back to the manor felt like a funeral procession. Sloane glided ahead, her white train sweeping over the grass, looking every bit the innocent bride. Harrison followed like a whipped dog. I trailed behind, my mind racing. I needed to signal Silas. I needed to find that shooter. As we entered the grand foyer, the music changed. The wedding march began to swell. The heavy doors to the ballroom were thrown open, revealing 200 of the most powerful people in the Northeast, all standing in hushed expectation. I took my place at the front of the aisle. I saw Julian standing at the altar. He looked at Sloane as she began her walk, and for a second, the pure, unadulterated love in his eyes nearly broke my resolve. He truly believed he was starting a life. He truly believed he was being saved. Sloane reached the altar and took his hands. Her smile was breathtaking, a masterpiece of deception. Harrison stood to Julian's left, the best man, looking like he was about to vomit. The minister began the service. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." I wasn't listening to the words. I was scanning the high windows of the Beaumont ballroom. I was looking for a glint of glass, a shadow that didn't belong. I saw it, a flicker of movement in the organ loft, high above the guests. I reached into my pocket and clicked the Mont Blanc pen 3 times, a prearranged signal for Silas, who was monitoring the feed from the security room. The service continued. If any man can show just cause why they may not be lawfully joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace. The traditional pause followed. It's a moment meant for silence, a breath before the plunge. I felt the weight of the room on me. I saw Sloane's eyes dart toward me, a silent warning. I stayed silent. I couldn't risk the shot. Not yet. I do, Julian said, his voice cracking with emotion. I do, Sloane said, her voice clear and triumphant. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the minister beamed. You may kiss the bride. As they leaned in, the room erupted in applause. Sloane pulled back, her eyes meeting mine over Julian's shoulder. She mouthed 3 words. Now, the study. The reception was a blur of forced smiles and expensive champagne. I led Sloane, Julian, and a reluctant Harrison toward the private library at the back of the Beaumont estate. The heavy doors clicked shut, cutting off the sound of the party. Julian looked confused. Dad? Sloane? What's going on? We're supposed to be doing the first dance. Sloane didn't waste time. She dropped the bouquet on a side table and turned to me. The deed, Alistair. And the trust documents. Julian, sit down. Your father has a wedding present for us. A wedding present? Julian laughed nervously. Dad, you already gave us the ring. What is this? Julian, I said, my voice steady. I need you to listen very carefully. Everything you think you know about the last 6 months is a lie. Sloane isn't pregnant. She never was. Julian's smile faltered. Dad, don't start this again. We went to the clinic. The clinic was a set, Julian, I said. I pulled out my phone and laid it on the desk. And Harrison? He wasn't just your best man. He's been Sloane's partner for years. They have a child together, Julian. A child they gave up in Ohio before they came here to find you. Julian looked at Harrison. Harrison? What is he talking about? Harrison couldn't even look him in the eye. He stared at the floor, his silence a screaming confession. Enough. Sloane stepped forward, her eyes wild. It doesn't matter what you know, Alistair. I'm a Sterling now. The marriage is legal. Sign the papers or Julian doesn't make it to the honeymoon. She pulled out the remote control again, her thumb hovering over the button. I have a man in the loft. 1 press. And Julian is gone. Sign them. Julian finally realized the horror he was in. He looked at Sloane, the woman he had just sworn his life to, and saw the monster underneath. Sloane? You'd kill me? I'd kill anyone to get what I've earned, she shrieked. Sign it, Alistair. Now. I picked up the pen from the desk, not the recorder, but a heavy fountain pen. I moved toward the deed. I'm signing, Sloane, I said. But you should know one thing. You said you were thorough, but you're not the only one who can hire a professional. At that moment, the doors to the library burst open. Silas Vane walked in, dragging a man in a camouflage jacket by the collar. The man's rifle was slung over Silas's shoulder, the bolt removed. Perimeter is clear, Alistair, Silas said, throwing the shooter to the floor. He was a cheap hire. Talked the moment I put a knife to his ribs. Sloane froze. She looked at the remote in her hand, then at the man on the floor. Her leverage was gone. Harrison, she hissed. Do something. But Harrison was already backing away. I'm out, Sloane. I told you this was too much. I'm not going to jail for murder. Julian stood up, his face a mask of cold, hard fury I had never seen before. He walked toward Sloane, his footsteps heavy on the Persian rug. She backed away until she hit the bookshelves. The baby, Julian whispered. There was never a baby. Julian, honey, I can explain. He didn't let her finish. He reached out and snatched the real sterling diamond off her finger. You don't get to wear this. You don't even get to say my name. He turned to me, his eyes wet with tears and shame. Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to believe you. I pulled him into a hug, the first real one we'd had in years. It's okay, son, we're going to fix this. But Sloane wasn't done. Even cornered, even exposed, she had one last venomous strike. She looked at us, a jagged, terrifying laugh bubbling up in her throat. You think you've won? She spat. You think a few records and a failed hit are enough to stop me? I've already filed the paperwork for a restraining order against you, Alistair. I've already leaked evidence of your financial crimes to the SEC. By tomorrow morning, Sterling and Sons will be under federal investigation. I'm going to burn your legacy to the ground, and I'm taking half of it as a widow's share when Julian inevitably succumbs to the stress. She stepped toward the door, her white dress stained with the dirt of the garden. See you in court, boys. As she reached for the handle, I spoke one last time. Sloan, I said, before you go, why don't you check your own offshore account? The one in the Caymans? She paused, her brow furrowing. She pulled out her phone, her fingers flying over the screen. I watched as her face went from defiance to absolute soul-crushing horror. It's empty, she whispered. How is it empty? Oh, because Sarah Miller, I said. The real Sarah Miller. She had a sister you forgot about, a sister who has been working for me for the last 3 months. The door opened, and a woman in a Beaumont server's uniform stepped in. She looked exactly like Sloan, but older, her face etched with a quiet, righteous anger. Hello, Sarah, the woman said. Or should I say, Sloan? I think it's time we talked about what happened in Ohio. The air in the library became heavy, thick with the scent of old paper and the metallic tang of Sloan's sudden, sharp terror. The woman standing in the doorway, Clara, didn't look like a waitress anymore. The humble posture was gone, replaced by a spine made of cold, Appalachian steel. She stared at Sloan with a gaze that had been simmering for 4 long years, a look of pure, focused reckoning. Sloan stumbled back against the mahogany bookshelves, her white lace sleeves snagging on the corner of a first-edition Dickens. It was a fitting metaphor for her life, a fragile, beautiful veneer catching on the jagged edges of reality. For a moment, the only sound was the muffled thump-thump of the bass from the wedding reception continuing in the ballroom, a heartbeat for a party that was already dead. Clara? Sloane's voice was a ragged whisper, the Sloan Sterling accent finally dissolving into something flatter, more desperate. You were supposed to be in Dayton. You were supposed to be gone. I was supposed to be mourning my sister in peace, Clara said, her voice low and trembling with a grief that had turned into a weapon. But then, I saw a photo in a society magazine, a rising star in the Greenwich antiquities world. A woman named Sloan who looked exactly like the girl who walked away from my sister's funeral without shedding a single tear. The girl who disappeared 2 days after Sarah's life insurance check cleared. Julian looked from Clara to Sloan, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the back of a leather chair to stay upright. Life insurance? Sloan, what is she talking about? Who is Sarah? I stepped forward, placing myself between my son and the wreckage of the woman he had just married. Sarah Miller was the real Sloan, Julian. Or rather, she was the girl whose life this woman stole. Sarah was a nursing student in Ohio. She had a bright future, a loving sister, and a roommate who was drowning in credit card debt and a sociopathic need for a better life. When Sarah died in that unfortunate car accident 4 years ago, Sarah's identity didn't die with her. This woman took it. She took the name, she took the credentials, and she took the money that was supposed to go to Clara to keep their family farm afloat. That's a lie, Sloan screamed, her face contorting into something unrecognizable. Alistair, you're reached into the gutter to find this woman. You're paying her to say this. Julian, look at me. I'm your wife. I'm the woman you love. You're a ghost story, Sloan, I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria. And Clara wasn't hard to find. She's been working as my interior consultant for the last 2 months. She's the one who helped me track the diverted funds from Sterling and Sons. She's the one who gave me the access codes to your private offshore server. You see, you used the same password for your Cayman account that Sarah used for her university login. Sentimentality is a peculiar weakness for someone so cold. Sloane's phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the hardwood floor. The empty bank account was only the beginning. She was looking at the total erasure of her existence. I didn't kill her, Sloan whimpered, her eyes darting toward the window, looking for an exit that didn't exist. It was an accident. The car skidded. I just saw an opportunity. I was nobody. I deserved a chance to be somebody. At the cost of my sister's life? Clara stepped closer, her hand blurring as she struck Sloan across the face. It wasn't a calculated move. It was 4 years of suppressed rage, exploding in a single second. Sloan collapsed onto the rug, her tiara tilting precariously on her head. Harrison Reed, who had been standing in the corner like a shadow, finally spoke. His voice was hollow, the sound of a man who realized he had hitched his wagon to a falling star. She told me Sarah was an old alias she used to escape an abusive ex. She told me the money she was funneling into the accounts was a finder's fee for the deals I was helping her close. I didn't know. I didn't know any of this. You knew enough, Harrison, I said, turning to him. You knew she was faking a pregnancy to trap my son. You knew you were betraying the man who called you a brother. Your greed made you blind, but your cowardice will make you a witness. You have 10 seconds to decide if you're going to be a co-defendant or a state's witness. Silas? Silas Vane stepped forward, holding a digital recorder. I've been recording this entire conversation, Alistair, along with the security footage from room 402 and the DNA results. The police are already at the estate gates. They're just waiting for my signal. Harrison's knees buckled. I'll tell them everything. The consulting kickbacks, the forged trust documents, the plan to liquidate the Sterling collection. Just keep me out of the Ohio stuff. I had nothing to do with that. Julian let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob. He walked over to the desk, picked up a crystal decanter of bourbon, and took a long, jagged swallow. He didn't look like the confident young man who had walked down the aisle an hour ago. He looked like he had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. Julian, I said, my heart breaking for him, I'm so sorry. I wanted to stop this sooner, but I had to be sure. I had to make sure you saw it with your own eyes. Julian wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes finally settling on Sloane, who was still huddled on the floor. You know what the worst part is? He asked, his voice hauntingly calm. I actually liked the person I was when I was with you. I thought I was finally becoming the man my father wanted me to be, but that man didn't exist, did he? He was just another prop in your play. Sloane looked up at him, her mascara running in black streaks down her pale face. Julian, I did love you. In my own way. You were the only one who didn't look at me like I was a project or a paycheck. I wanted this to be real. Then you should have told the truth, Julian said. He turned to me, the decanter still in his hand. What happens now, Dad? There are 200 people out there waiting for a cake cutting. There's a marriage certificate with my name on it. The marriage is voidable, Julian. Fraud is a powerful legal lever, I said. And as for the guests, the party is over. Silas will handle the announcement. We'll tell them the bride had a medical emergency. It's not even a lie, in a way. Her soul is in critical condition. But just as Silas reached for the door to call in the authorities, Sloane stood up. She wiped her face, her eyes suddenly clearing, that terrifyingly sharp intelligence returning to her gaze. She wasn't defeated yet. She reached into the bodice of her dress and pulled out a small laminated card. You think you've caught me in a trap, Alistair, she said, her voice regaining its edge. You think you're the only one who knows how to use the past as a weapon? She held up the card. It was an old, faded photograph of a woman I hadn't seen in 30 years. A woman who looked remarkably like my late wife, Eleanor, but with a different set of eyes. I didn't just spend my time researching Sarah Miller, Sloane said, stepping toward me, ignoring Julian and Clara. I spent my time in the Sterling archives, in the boxes you kept locked in the attic after Eleanor died. Do you remember the Sterling & Sons audit of 1994, Alistair? The one that almost destroyed the company before a mysterious benefactor stepped in and saved everything? My blood ran cold. The 1994 audit. The year Sterling & Sons had been accused of selling looted antiquities from a dig in Turkey. We had been cleared, but only because the key witness, a young curator named Elena, had disappeared. Eleanor wasn't your first wife, Alistair, Sloane whispered, her voice a venomous purr. And she wasn't the mother of your first child. Elena was. And I think the SEC would be very interested to know that the benefactor who saved this company was actually the insurance payout from a woman who didn't die in an accident, but was paid to vanish so you could marry a socialite with a better pedigree. Julian froze. Dad? What is she talking about? She's lying, Julian, I said, but I could feel the sweat beginning to prickle at my hairline. She's desperate. Am I? Sloane smiled, and this time it was the smile of a winner. Because I didn't just find a photo, Alistair. I found Elena. She's living in a quiet villa in Italy, funded by a monthly pension from a Sterling-owned shell company. If I go down, if Clara gets her justice, then I make sure that phone call goes out. Julian will find out that his entire life, his mother, his name, his inheritance is built on the blood and exile of the woman you actually loved. She looked at the clock on the wall. You have 5 minutes to tell Silas to let me walk out of here. I want the car, the real diamond, and a head start. Or I pull the pin on the Sterling legacy, and we all burn together. I looked at Julian, who was staring at me with a look of dawning horror. I looked at Clara, who was waiting for the justice she had been promised. And then I looked at Sloane, the woman who had truly become the most dangerous thing in my world. I didn't know it yet. I thought, the room starting to tilt. But the secret I had kept for 30 years was about to become the final nail in my son's coffin. "Dad?" Julian's voice was a plea. "Tell her she's lying. Tell me there isn't another woman. Tell me my mother was who you said she was." I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Because in the back of my mind, I could still hear the sound of Elena's voice, the night I told her she had to leave for the sake of the Sterling name. What happened next didn't just change the story, it shattered the very foundation of the Sterling family. The silence that followed Sloane's revelation wasn't just a lack of sound, it was the heavy, suffocating weight of a tombstone. I looked at Julian, and the expression on his face shattered what was left of my soul. It wasn't just shock. It was the slow, agonizing death of every memory he held dear. His mother, Eleanor, the woman he'd idolized, the woman whose portrait hung in the center of our home, was suddenly a footnote in a darker, older story. I felt the foundation of my life, the prestigious Sterling name I'd spent 40 years polishing, crumbling into dust beneath my feet. Sloane stood there, her white wedding dress gleaming in the dim light of the library, looking like a victorious demon. She knew she had me. She had found the one secret I had buried deeper than the foundations of the Beaumont estate. "Dad?" Julian's voice was barely a whisper. It was the voice of a little boy lost in the woods. "Tell me she's lying. Tell me there is no Elena. Tell me Mom was." She was the only one. I couldn't look him in the eye. I stared at the grain of the mahogany desk, seeing the ghost of the man I used to be. "Julian," I started, my voice thick and unfamiliar. "The past. It's more complicated than I ever let you see. The 1994 audit. We were in trouble. I was young, I was ambitious, and I made choices that I've spent every day since trying to atone for." "Choices?" Julian shouted, the crystal decanter in his hand rattling against the wood. "You sent a woman away. You paid her to disappear so you could marry a woman with a better pedigree? My life. My whole life is a lie because you wanted a better seat at the table?" "It wasn't just about the seat, Julian," I said, finally meeting his gaze. "It was about survival. But Sloane, she's twisted the truth into something even uglier." Sloane laughed, a sharp, triumphant sound that cut through the room. "The truth is plenty ugly on its own, Alistair. Now, the clock is ticking. 5 million in the trust, the Hamptons deed, and I want the real Sterling diamond back in my hand. Otherwise, the press gets the files, the Italian villa address, and the DNA profile of the daughter Elena had in 1995. Your daughter, Alistair, Julian's half-sister." Julian froze. His eyes went wide, his face drained of all color. He looked at me, his mouth hanging open. I felt the air leave the room. This was the twist I hadn't even told Silas. I hadn't known Elena was pregnant when she left. I had sent her away into the night, thinking I was protecting the legacy, never knowing I was abandoning my own blood. The collapse was total. I sank into my leather chair, feeling every one of my 60 years. I had spent my life as a curator of fine things, but I had been a butcher of people. I had tried to save Julian from a predator, only to realize I was the one who had invited the darkness in 30 years ago. 5 minutes, Alistair," Sloane purred, checking her diamond-encrusted watch, the one Julian had bought her for the rehearsal dinner. "Or does Julian want to meet his sister in the middle of a federal racketeering trial?" I looked at Silas Vane. The fixer stood by the door, his expression unreadable. He had seen 1,000 family secrets, but even he seemed taken aback by the scale of this wreckage. Clara, the woman who had come for justice for her sister Sarah, looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. She had come to help me take down a monster, only to find she was standing in a room full of them. "Let her go, Silas," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Alistair, think about this," Silas started. "I said, let her go," I roared, slamming my fist onto the desk. "Give her the keys to the Bentley. Give her the ring. I'll sign the deed." Julian didn't say a word. He just stood there, staring at me as if I were a stranger. He watched as I pulled the Hamptons deed from the drawer, the property that was supposed to be his inheritance, and signed my name in shaking, jagged script. I handed it to Sloane. She snatched it from my hand, her eyes gleaming. She reached out and took the Sterling diamond from the desk, slipping it onto her finger with a practiced flick of the wrist. "Smart man, Alistair. You always knew the price of an original." She turned to Harrison, who was still cowering in the corner. "Come on, Harrison. We're leaving. You can drive." Harrison didn't hesitate. He followed her out of the room like a whipped dog, eager to escape the radioactive fallout of the Sterling name. Clara followed them out, not to help, but to vanish into the night herself. She had seen enough of this world. The door clicked shut, leaving me alone with Julian and Silas. The bass from the ballroom was still thumping, a mockery of the silence in the library. Julian walked to the window and stared out at the dark rose garden. "I don't even know who you are," he said, his back to me. "Everything I thought we were. It was just a curated exhibit. You're no better than she is. You just have better taste in how you lie." He turned and walked toward the door. "Julian, please," I said, standing up. "Where are you going?" "Away from here," he said, his voice flat and dead. "Don't follow me. Don't call me. As far as I'm concerned, the Sterling legacy ended tonight. You can keep your books and your vases, Alistair. They're the only things in this house that aren't a lie." He walked out, and a few moments later, I heard the roar of his sports car as it tore down the Beaumont driveway. I sat back down in the silence. Silas Vane walked over and picked up the Mont Blanc pen from the floor. He laid it on the desk in front of me. "What now, Alistair? She has the deed. She has the ring. She has the leverage." I looked at the pen. I thought about the daughter in Italy I never knew. I thought about Julian's broken heart. And then, I felt something shift inside me. The collapse was over. Rock bottom was a cold, hard place, and it gave me something I hadn't had in years. Clarity. "She thinks she's won because she found a ghost," I said, my voice gaining a new, dangerous edge. "She thinks I'm the same man I was in 1994. A man who was afraid of a scandal. A man who would trade his soul for a reputation." I looked up at Silas. "She made one mistake. She didn't realize that once you've lost everything, you have nothing left to protect, and a man with nothing to protect is the most dangerous thing she's ever encountered." "What are you thinking?" Silas asked, a faint, grim smile touching his lips. "She wants to play with the past? Fine, let's give her the full history," I said. I picked up the phone. I didn't know it yet, but the revenge I was about to set in motion wouldn't just take down Sloane. It was going to require me to burn my own world to the ground to make sure she was caught in the flames. I dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 decades. It was an international line, a direct link to a quiet villa in Tuscany. "Elena?" I said when a woman's voice answered. "It's Alistair. I'm done hiding. It's time to come home and bring our daughter. We have a wedding to finish." I hung up and looked at Silas. "She thinks she has the leverage because she knows Elena exists. She doesn't realize that Elena is the only person in the world who hates her more than I do." "How so?" Silas asked. "Because Sloane didn't just find Elena," I said, a dark realization clicking into place. "She tried to extort her first. 2 weeks ago, in Italy. Elena called the local police, but she was afraid to call me. Sloane thought she could squeeze both ends of the secret, but Elena has been waiting for 30 years for a reason to come back, and I just gave her the best one." The reversal had begun. Sloane was currently driving toward the Hamptons, clutching a deed to a house that was about to become her prison. She didn't know that the Sterling and Sons audit of 1,994 hadn't just been about looted antiquities. It had been about a very specific set of forged documents that Sloane had just used as the basis for her own extortion. By using that information to blackmail me, she had just unwittingly tied herself to a federal crime that had no statute of limitations. "Silas, call the SEC," I said. "Tell them I want to make a full confession about the 1,994 audit, and tell them I have the person who is currently in possession of the forged documents and the extorted assets." "You'll go to prison, Alistair," Silas warned. "Maybe," I said, looking at the portrait of Eleanor on the wall. "But Sloane is going somewhere much worse. She's going back to being Sarah Miller, with a life sentence attached to her name, and Julian will finally know the truth, all of it, even the parts that burn." The first step of the plan was simple. I had to let Sloane feel like she had won for exactly 12 hours. I had to let her get to the Hamptons. I had to let her think she was safe. What happened next was the beginning of the end. As the sun began to rise over Greenwich, I sat in my library, watching the empty champagne bottles being cleared from the lawn. The party was over, the Sterling name was in ruins, but for the first time in 30 years, I could breathe. I didn't know yet that Sloane had one more trick up her sleeve. I didn't know that she hadn't gone to the Hamptons at all. My phone buzzed. It was a photo from a burner number. It was Julian, unconscious in the passenger seat of his own car, with Harrison Reed standing over him, holding a syringe. The text read, "Change of plans, Alistair." The deed was a nice start, but now I want the entire sterling collection liquidated and moved to a Swiss account. You have until noon. If the money isn't there, Julian doesn't wake up from his overdose. I felt the ice return to my veins. She hadn't taken the exit. She had doubled down. She was going for the kill. I didn't know it yet, I whispered, but the only way to save my son was to become the monster everyone already thought I was. The image of Julian, slumped in the passenger seat with that needle hovering near his arm, burned into my retinas like a brand. I had spent 40 years meticulously preserving the past, protecting fragile things from the ravages of time. Yet I had failed to protect the only thing that actually mattered. My son was a pawn in a game I had inadvertently started 3 decades ago. Rock bottom isn't a place you fall to. It's a place you're pushed into, and the air is very thin down here. I looked at the clock on the library wall. 6:14 a.m. The morning light was beginning to bleed through the heavy velvet curtains, mocking me with its promise of a new day. I had less than 6 hours to liquidate the Sterling & Sons core collection, the inventory that represented my life's work, and move the capital into a Swiss account I couldn't track. Silas Vane stood by the window, his hand resting on the hilt of a concealed blade. He didn't offer platitudes. He knew the look of a man who had finally decided to burn his own house down to kill the vermin inside. "She's moved him to the old industrial district near the South Norwalk docks," Silas said, looking at a tablet that was tracking the digital signature of the photo Sloan had sent. "The signal is bouncing off a series of VPNs, but Harrison's car has a built-in LoJack system he forgot to disable. They're in an abandoned cold storage warehouse. It's a fortress, Alistair. One way in, one way out." "She doesn't want a way out," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "She wants a payout and a body. She knows Julian is the only witness to the kidnapping, and she knows Harrison is too weak to keep his mouth shut once the adrenaline wears off." I walked to the large, floor-to-ceiling safe behind my desk. I punched in a code that hadn't been used since the 1994 audit. This wasn't where we kept the antiquities. This was where we kept the Black Ledger, the true history of every piece of art that had passed through our hands, including the looted items that had nearly ended us. I didn't know it yet, but the very documents I was about to use to save my son would also be the ones to ensure I never walked free again. "Silas, I need you to initiate the red folder liquidation protocol with our contacts in Zurich," I instructed. "Tell them I'm selling the Sultan's collection at a 90% loss for immediate wire transfer. They'll know it's blood money. They won't ask questions. Alistair, that's your entire retirement. It's the legacy," Silas warned. "The legacy is a lie, Silas." "You heard her." I turned on him, my eyes wild. "It's built on a woman I exiled and a son I lied to. If I have to spend the rest of my life in a cell to make sure Julian wakes up tomorrow, then that's the most honest work I've ever done." The phone in my hand buzzed. It was a video call. I answered it immediately. Sloane's face filled the screen. She was no longer wearing the wedding dress. She was in a black tactical jacket, her hair pulled back in a tight, merciless bun. Behind her, I could see the rusted interior of the warehouse and Harrison Reed, looking like he was about to collapse, holding a steady hand over Julian's mouth. "The sun is up, Alistair," Sloane said, her voice devoid of any human warmth. "I see the activity in your Zurich accounts. Good, you're learning. But don't think for a second that I don't see Silas Vane lurking in the background. If his car gets within 5 miles of this dock, Harrison pushes the plunger. Do you understand?" "I understand, Sloane," I said, leaning into the camera. "But you should understand something too. The money you're taking? It's flagged. Not by the police, but by the people I bought those antiquities from in '94. There's a reason I kept that money in a stagnant account for 30 years. It's marked capital. The moment you touch it in a Swiss bank, a notification goes out to some very dangerous men in Istanbul who have been looking for the person who stole their history." I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. It was a lie mostly, but in her world, greed was always accompanied by paranoia. "You're bluffing," she hissed. "Am I? Check the ledger entry for the Osmanli vase. It's in the digital file I just sent to the bank. Look at the end-user clause." His. She looked away from the camera, presumably checking her tablet. I used that split second to hold up a small handwritten note to Silas. It read, "Find Clara. Tell her the boat is ready." Sloane looked back, her face twisted in a snarl. I don't care about Turkish mobsters, Alistair. I'll be long gone before they even clear the tarmac. 2 hours. If the full 20 million isn't in the account, you get a package in the mail, and it won't be an antique. The line went dead. I looked at Silas. Did you get the coordinates? Locked in, he said. But Alistair, Clara? Why her? She's a waitress from Ohio. She's a woman who knows exactly how Sarah Miller thinks, I said, and she's the only person Sloan won't see coming. Everyone else, you, the police, the SEC, Sloan has a countermove for. But she thinks Clara is just a victim. She doesn't realize that a victim with a plan is a predator. By 10:30 a.m., the Sterling collection was gone. 4 decades of beauty, history, and craftsmanship sold off in a series of frantic, low-value transactions that made my soul ache. The money was sitting in the Swiss account, a digital pile of silver that represented my absolute surrender. I drove to the South Norwalk docks alone. I didn't take the Bentley. I took an old, nondescript service van from the store. I wore a simple work jacket, looking more like a delivery man than a disgraced socialite. The warehouse was a hulking skeleton of corrugated metal and salt-stained brick. I parked 100 yards away and walked the rest of the distance. My heart was a drum in my chest, every beat a reminder of the noon deadline. I stepped through the small side door. The air inside was freezing, smelling of old fish and diesel. In the center of the vast, open space, a single floodlight illuminated a chair. Julian was there. He was awake now, his eyes wide and panicked, a thick layer of duct tape over his mouth. Harrison stood behind him, looking terrified, holding the syringe like a holy relic he didn't want to touch. "Where is she, Harrison?" I called out, my voice echoing off the high, rusted ceiling. Sloan stepped out from behind a stack of shipping crates. She was holding a suppressed pistol in one hand and her phone in the other. "Right here, Alistair. You're early. I like that." "The money is there, Sloan," I said, holding up my own phone. 20 million. The Swiss bank has confirmed the receipt. Let him go. "In a minute," Sloan said, walking toward Julian. "First, we have to talk about the marked money. I had Marcus Vane check it. You were lying. There is no Turkish mob, just a very old man trying to scare a girl with a ghost story." She leaned down and stroked Julian's hair with the barrel of the gun. "You almost had me, Alistair. You really did. But you forgot one thing. I've been playing this game since I was 16. You've been playing it since you got rich. There's a difference in the hunger." "Harrison," I said, ignoring her. "Look at him. Look at Julian. You grew up in my house. You ate at my table. Are you really going to kill him for a woman who will discard you the moment you leave this building?" Harrison's hand began to shake. She said we'd go to South America. She said we'd start over with the baby we lost. "The baby she gave up for adoption because you were an inconvenience to her career?" I shouted. "Harrison, wake up. She doesn't love you. She's using you as a trigger man, so you're the one who goes down for the murder while she flies private to Zurich." "Shut up," Sloan screamed, aiming the gun at me. "Harrison, do it. Now." Harrison looked at the needle, then at Julian, then at Sloan. He was a man caught between two worlds, and the pressure was finally snapping his spine. "I can't," Harrison whispered. "Sloan, I can't do it." Sloan didn't hesitate. She turned the gun toward Harrison, her finger tightening on the trigger. But before she could fire, a shadow moved in the rafters above her. A heavy, industrial hook, swinging on a rusted chain, crashed into the crates beside her, sending a cloud of wood splinters and dust into the air. Sloan ducked, firing a wild shot into the darkness. "What the hell was that?" she shrieked. "That," I said, a grim smile finally touching my lips, "is the part of the history you didn't research." From the shadows, Clara stepped out. She wasn't holding a gun. She was holding the remote control for the warehouse's overhead crane, the one I had secretly had Silas repair 2 hours earlier. "Hello, Sarah," Clara said, her voice amplified by the warehouse's acoustics. "I told you I'd see you again. I just didn't tell you I'd be the one looking down." Sloan spun around, aiming at Clara, but she was out of range, standing on the high catwalk. "You bitch, I'll kill you both." "You'll try," I said, stepping toward Julian. But as I reached for my son, the warehouse doors behind me groaned open. A fleet of black SUVs screeched into the space, their headlights blinding us. Men in tactical gear with FBI and SEC emblazoned on their vests swarmed the floor. "Drop the weapon," a voice boomed over a megaphone. Sloan looked around, her eyes darting like a trapped rat. She looked at the money on her phone, then at the federal agents, then at me. She realized the trap wasn't just the crane or the marked money. The trap was the confession I had made to the SEC at 8 a.m. I had given them everything. The 1,994 audit, the looted items, the offshore accounts. I had turned myself in as the bait, knowing that the only way to get the feds to move fast enough was to offer them the big fish myself and the current predator Sloan. "Alistair Sterling, you are under arrest," the lead agent shouted. Sloan dropped the gun, her hands shaking. She looked at me, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You ruined it. You burned everything just to stop me?" "I didn't burn it to stop you, Sloan," I said, as the agents tackled her to the ground. "I burned it to save him." I reached Julian and ripped the tape from his mouth. He was gasping, his face wet with tears. I pulled him into a hug, ignoring the handcuffs being clicked onto my own wrists by another agent. "I'm sorry, Julian," I whispered into his ear. "I'm so sorry." Julian looked at me, his eyes full of a complicated, agonizing mixture of love and betrayal. "You're going to jail, Dad." "I know," I said, "but you're going to live." As they led me away toward the SUVs, I saw Harrison being loaded into another car, his head down in shame. I saw Clara standing on the catwalk, watching Sloan being dragged out in chains. She had her justice, but as I reached the door, I saw a woman standing in the shadows of the dock. A woman with graying hair and a familiar, elegant coat. Elena. She was here. She had come back from Italy, and beside her stood a young woman, maybe 25, with my eyes and Julian's chin. My daughter. The reversal was complete. I had lost my fortune, my reputation, and my freedom. I was a criminal in the eyes of the law and a monster in the eyes of the society I'd spent my life courting. But as I looked at my two children, the son I'd saved and the daughter I'd just found, I realized that the Sterling legacy had finally, for the first time, become something real. What happened next, I thought as the car door slammed shut, was the only part of the story I hadn't written yet. But as the SUV began to pull away, I saw Sloan leaning out of the back of the police cruiser, a jagged, terrifying smile on her face. She leaned toward the officer next to her and whispered something. The officer's eyes went wide. He picked up his radio and shouted, "Stop the Sterling vehicle! Now! There's a secondary device!" My heart stopped. The syringe. It wasn't just an overdose threat. "I didn't know it yet," I whispered, the car screeching to a halt. But Sloan Sterling wasn't done with us, not by a long shot. The screech of the tires against the wet asphalt of the South Norwalk docks was the last sound I expected to hear. The FBI agent driving my vehicle slammed on the brakes so hard my forehead nearly cracked against the steel partition. Outside, the world had devolved into a chaos of flashing red and blue lights. I saw the officer who had been processing Sloan Sarah backing away from her transport vehicle, his hand hovering over his holster as he barked into his shoulder mic. "I didn't know it yet," I whispered to the empty, shadowed back of the SUV, but the final move in this game hadn't been played by me. It had been played by the woman who had nothing left to lose. The back door of my vehicle was yanked open. The lead agent, a man named Miller, who looked like he'd aged a decade in the last 6 hours, pulled me out by my elbow. He didn't lead me toward the processing center. He led me toward the police cruiser where Sloan sat, her face illuminated by the rhythmic strobe of the sirens. She was smiling. It wasn't the practiced, elegant smile of Sloan Sterling. It was the jagged, broken grin of a woman who had just set the world on fire and was waiting to feel the heat. "She says the syringe wasn't just saline and it wasn't just an overdose," Miller hissed, his grip on my arm like a vice. "She says it was a delivery system. Alistair, if you ever loved your son, you'll tell us what she's talking about." I looked at Sloan. "What did you do?" "You were so focused on the black ledger and the 1,994 audit, Alistair." Sloan purred, her voice muffled by the glass but still clear enough to chill my marrow. "You were so worried about the ghosts of Italy. But you forgot that I'm a student of biology too. That syringe? It contained a very rare, very aggressive strain of a synthetic toxin. Julian doesn't have hours. He has minutes, unless you give me the one thing you kept for yourself." "The money is gone, Sloan. I gave it to the feds," I shouted, my composure finally snapping. "I don't want the money anymore," she said, her eyes fixed on mine. "I want the confession, not the one you gave the SEC. I want the real one. The one where you admit that Eleanor didn't die of a heart attack. The one where you admit you poisoned the woman you claimed to love so you could keep the Sterling name from being tarnished by her desire to leave you." The world went silent. I felt the gaze of every agent, every officer, and most importantly, Julian, who was standing 20 feet away, being supported by a medic. He heard her. The accusation hung in the salty air like a shroud. She's lying, I whispered, but even to my own ears, the words sounded hollow. Am I? Sloane asked. Harrison found the vials in the attic, Alistair. The same ones I used to fill that syringe. It's a family tradition, isn't it? Preserving the legacy by pruning the branches that grow too far. I looked at Julian. He was staring at me, his eyes wide with a new, terrifying kind of realization. This was the final twist. She hadn't just come for my fortune. She had come to reveal that the pillar of society was the greatest forgery of all. She had found the one sin that no amount of curation could hide. Dad? Julian's voice was a ragged sob. Is it true? Did you kill Mom? I looked at my son, the boy I had burned my world to save. I looked at the man he had become fragile, broken, and now poisoned by the truth. I realized then that I couldn't save him with another lie. The only antidote was the one thing I had spent 30 years running from. Yes, I said, the word barely a breath. The gasp that went through the crowd was collective. Miller's grip on my arm loosened. Julian collapsed to his knees, the medic barely catching him. I did it for us, Julian, I said, stepping toward him, even as the agents raised their weapons. She was going to take you. She was going to take the Sterling name and drag it through the mud of a divorce that would have revealed everything. I couldn't let the legacy die. Sloane's laughter erupted from the car, a high, piercing sound of absolute victory. There it is, the Sterling truth. The antidote is in the lining of the box the real diamond came in, Julian. Your father kept it there just in case he ever had to prune someone else. Silas Vane moved before anyone else. He sprinted to the service van, grabbed the silver box, and ripped the velvet lining away. Taped to the bottom was a small amber vial. He ran to the medic, who immediately began the administration. I stood there, handcuffed and hollow, watching as the life returned to my son's face. The physical poison was leaving him, but the spiritual one was permanent. I had saved his life, but I had ended our relationship. The drive to the federal holding facility was the longest journey of my life. I sat in the back of the SUV, watching the sun finally crest over the horizon. The Beaumont estate, the Sterling collection, the reputation, it was all gone. I was no longer a curator. I was a convict. But as the heavy iron gates of the prison closed behind me, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. For 30 years, I had been a man holding up a crumbling ceiling. Now, the roof had finally fallen, and for the first time, I could see the sky. 6 months later, I sat in a small, sterile visitation room. The glass between me and the world was thick, but it was the most honest window I'd ever looked through. A woman sat down on the other side. It wasn't Julian. It was the young woman from the parking lot, my daughter from Italy. Her name was Gianna. She looked like Elena, but she had my grandmother's hands. Julian won't come, she said, her voice soft and accented. He sold the manor. He's opened a small wood-turning shop in Vermont. He doesn't go by Sterling anymore. I don't blame him, I said. How is your mother? Elena is at peace, Gianna replied. She didn't want the money you sent. She gave it all to Clara's family in Ohio. The farm is saved. Sarah Miller, the real one, has a proper memorial now. And Sloane? I asked. She's in a maximum security ward, Gianna said, her eyes turning cold. Harrison Reed testified against her. She'll never see the sun without a fence in front of it. She tried to play the insanity card, but the judge saw through the masterpiece. We sat in silence for a moment. I looked at this daughter I had abandoned, this piece of my history I had tried to delete. She wasn't an antique to be curated. She was a living, breathing consequence. Why did you come, Gianna? Because Julian asked me to, she said. She reached into her bag and pressed a photograph against the glass. It was a picture of a small, simple wooden cradle, beautifully carved and unvarnished. He wanted you to see the first thing he built that wasn't a lie. He's going to be a father, a real one, to a child who will never know the name Sterling. I pressed my hand against the glass, matching her palm. I felt a tear track through the wrinkles of my face, not a tear of grief, but of a quiet, agonizing gratitude. The legacy had been destroyed, the fortune was gone, and the Sterling name was a curse. But in that wooden cradle, I saw the only thing I had ever truly gotten right. I had cleared the ground for something honest to grow. Tell him, I started, my voice failing. Tell him, the wood is beautiful. It's an original. Gianna nodded, tucked the photo away, and stood up. She walked out of the room without looking back, leaving me in the silence of my cell. I walked back to my cot and sat down. I picked up a small, weathered book I'd been allowed to keep, a collection of poems Eleanor had loved. I realized then that revenge isn't about the person you destroy. It's about the truth that remains after the fire has burned out. Sloane had wanted to destroy me, and in a way, she had succeeded. She had taken my freedom and my son's love, but in her attempt to burn my world, she had accidentally burned away the mask I had worn for 30 years. I was finally just Alistair, not the magnate, not the curator, not the pillar of society, just a man sitting in the dark, waiting for the end of a story he should never have started. The final moral of the Sterling family wasn't found in a ledger or a safe. It was found in the realization that the most expensive thing you can ever own is a secret, and the only way to be truly wealthy is to have nothing left to hide. I closed my eyes and listened to the distant sound of the prison guard's footsteps. It wasn't the music of a ballroom, and it wasn't the silence of a library. But for the first time in my life, it was real, and as the darkness of the cell settled over me, I realized that I had finally, at the very last second, found the one thing I had spent 40 years looking for: the truth, in all its ugly, beautiful, and devastating glory.